Welcome. I'm here with two wonderful people that are very active in the world of academia, Jenny Summey and Paul Ringel. And we're going to talk today with them about a new idea they came up with and have forged a new company. And it's very unique. I don't think anyone out there has probably heard something quite unique as this. So we'll let you start, Jenny. Tell us what's going on.
Hi. Well, thanks for having us on. A few years ago, being a native North Carolinian and not wanting to pursue the tenure track outside of North Carolina, I started getting into the world of historical consulting. And that involved typically being contracted by nonprofits, or municipalities or museums to do contract research. And so I was like, well, let's see if we can make a business out of this. And so Paul was, he is at High Point University and was doing some of the same things, and we kept kind of crossing paths in this consulting world. And so we joined forces and started The Source Historical Consulting, and we have been fortunate enough to be able to work with organizations like the City of High Point, like Muse Winston-Salem, and the Glacier National Park Conservancy, and we are excited to continue our reach in the Triad and in North Carolina.
Wow. Well, Paul, I know that I've known both of you guys for several years, and I would say that this is like a Batman and Robin combination. You know, it couldn't be better. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing with the new Source.
Sure, yeah. So as Jenny said, we were kind of crossing paths in a whole bunch of different ways. She came and participated in a conference at High Point that I ran a couple of years ago. Actually, more than a couple of years ago. It was before COVID. And then we worked together on the One High Point project in 2022, 2023 for the city of High Point, looking at the history of the city through the lens of race. And so I've been doing a lot of work for the last decade or so on African American history in High Point. My students did an oral history project where we interviewed a bunch of the alumni of William Penn High School, which was the segregated black high school in High Point. We did an exhibit for one of the churches so that they could take it to their church conventions on their history, which was one of the leading civil rights churches in High Point.
Which church was that? Because we have a lot of them that are members here at GCT.
So it was Congregational United Church of Christ in High Point.
Okay.
And so we were doing very similar kind of work. And, you know, I've written a book and I've written some scholarly articles, and those are great. And, you know, I've been fortunate enough to get good feedback on those. But I wanted to have, and I know Jenny does too, broader access and you know, really have an impact on a larger audience and be able to reach people with a lot of these stories that don't get told and often get forgotten, not only by individuals, but by entire communities.
Yeah. Well, that sounds great. I know you did most of your work at Catawba.
I did my undergraduate work at Catawba College with Michael Bitzer.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and then I got my PhD at UNC Greensboro.
Okay. The big G.
Yes.
Well, you know, to me, I look at it and I hear some of the anecdotal stories that we have talked about off camera, and they're amazing. And I would just say that I would love to hear, Paul was telling me a story about an African American family in High Point, and the story had been basically untold, and it was unearthed through that type of digging that they do. So could you possibly tell that story again?
Sure. Yeah, so in 2017, Jimmy Tomlin, who's a reporter at the High Point Enterprise, ran a story, and he periodically does these stories that he calls High Point Confidential, where he finds some story from the past in the city that nobody knows about. And so he found a story about a barber back in 1921, an African-American barber who tried to kill his family. And it turned out, and Jimmy didn't know this, that there were still descendants of this barber living in High Point. So one of his granddaughters, he has 5 granddaughters who are still alive, and one of them lives in High Point. And somebody came to her with this story and said, is this your grandfather? And she looked at, actually I think he said, well, is this your uncle? Because her grandfather and uncle had the same name. And she said, no, that's my grandfather. And the family knew nothing about this. And of course, all the people who were involved, this was the 20s, they're gone. Yeah. And so they asked me, I knew them through one of the other projects I'd done, and they asked me to help them do some research. And they did a lot of it themselves because one of them was a former general manager of a television station in Charleston, so she knew what she was doing. But she went through and looked at all the old newspapers from the time period and found out that the Klan had been announced to be coming back to High Point just a week before this attack. And they knew that their grandfather had been a refugee, I don't know if that's quite the right word, but from Wilmington from the 1898 massacre. But they didn't really know much more about it than that. And so they knew that their great-grandfather, they thought he'd been a judge in Wilmington. So initially they asked me to see, can you help us find this great-grandfather who was a judge? And I said, how hard can that be, right? So I went back and I looked everywhere, and I called people down in Wilmington, and he wasn't there. But I did finally find him, and the reason I couldn't find him is because he wasn't a judge, he was a police officer. Wow. And so in 1897, for those of you who know the Wilmington story, there was an interracial government elected in the city in 1897, and they appointed 10 police officers who were black, and he was one of them. Wow. And his brother-in-law, so I don't quite know what the great uncle, I don't know quite what the relationship is, but the police officer's brother-in-law was one of the black county commissioners that was elected in 1897. And I kept going further and further back, and we found their great-great-grandfather, who I think was the wealthiest black man in New Hanover County in the 1870s.
Wow.
And so we're still doing research on that, but this is the kind of thing that whole communities just forget these stories. And this was a big front page story, not just in High Point or Greensboro, but in Raleigh and in Charlotte. And nobody, we have connections in the black community who remember back to the late 40s, and nobody knew the story.
Wow.
One of them happened to see the newspaper and said, well, I know that family, but didn't know the connection. And so these are the kinds of stories that are getting forgotten, and sometimes it's accidental, and sometimes they're kind of forgotten on purpose, right? People don't want to go back to these stories. And so, we're not looking to be, dig up the old scandals or anything like that. But we do think that in a time when a lot of, people aren't getting the history education they need, right, and when a lot of people aren't aware of the past and how it's still shaping the way our politics and our culture are developing now, that this is a kind of a process that a lot of cities, a lot of nonprofits, a lot of corporations, we've done some work with some pretty big multinational corporations, that if they really want to look and see what's there and they're willing to sort of grapple with it, not in terms of blame, we're not looking to blame people, but we're looking to get these stories out there because people don't know this history, and I'm constantly shocked by my students.
Yeah. Well, I think I related to you earlier that, I'm not a young guy by any stretch of the imagination. I never knew about the Wilmington race riots until I was an adult, and even more so in the last 20, 25 years. Mm-hmm. And that was a terrible part of North Carolina's history that I never knew about. So, I mean, it's just, and these things can be tangential. I mean, it's,
And Wilmington's still dealing with the legacy of that, right? Wilmington was a majority black city in 1898, and now I think their population, the black population, I don't quote me exactly, but I think it's about 20%. It's about 20%. Yeah. So there are lasting legacies, and our students, You know, I had a student the other day who grew up in North Carolina who didn't know about the sit-ins.
Wow.
And so,
Wow.
you know, that's not her fault.
Yeah.
But it's,
Yeah.
they're not getting this education. And so we're trying to get to, you know, all these different, you know, universities, municipalities, corporations, nonprofits, museums, where we can help with our knowledge of North Carolina history and broader history too.
Right. Well, can you speak to what you're working with now with RJR?
Not too terribly much. But
Okay. Okay.
But yes,
Mum's the
next 2025 is the 150th anniversary of the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, and we've contracted with Muse Winston-Salem.
And tell people what
and
Muse
Muse is the Museum of Understanding, Storytelling, and Engagement in Winston-Salem, and it will be opening its new facilities, I believe, in 2026, kind of near Old Salem. And basically, we are researching how RJR, how the family, how the corporation itself helped build the city of Winston-Salem.
Well-
And its footprint, whether it's, you know, the historic Reynoldstown community that was built specifically for employees of RJR, whether it's the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, which gives millions of dollars to charities across North Carolina, or whether it's something like Renolda,
Yeah.
that is a haven of art.
What a great facility.
And it is, it's a
Oh.
beautiful facility. But how this, not just this corporation, but this family, in this, you know, fairly small city, you know, house this, you know, international conglomerate, but how it also built the city of Winston-Salem.
Well, I went to Wake Forest, and I will tell you that school would not be there without the Reynolds.
Quite literally. I mean, they
Very
moved
literally.
it. They moved it from the Triangle to
They said-
Winston-Salem.
They
Well,
said,
the-
here is the land.
There was
Put your school here.
the old joke was that the foundation went to the Presbyterians and said, "Will you, if Davidson College will move to Winston-Salem, we'll make them a great university." And they said, "We are already a great school. We don't need to move." And they went down to the Baptist in Wake Forest and said, "We'll make you a great school if you'll come to Winston-Salem." And they said, "When can we start?" So they definitely would, Wake would not be there, and it wouldn't be the great school that it is without it. Because, you know, it's not just the buildings and bricks and mortar, but they are still pumping money in
Very much
for
so.
research and art and some of those great things. Well, what are some of the other organizations that you've worked with? And first of all, I'm gonna backtrack. Hold that thought. She is the author of the book on Elrita Alexander, and which, you know, if you're from Greensboro, or even if you've lived here for a short period of time, if you don't know the story of Elrita Alexander, you've been living under a rock. But she did so much research and has written the book. And what can you tell us about that as far as your research skills and what it all happened?
Yeah, and it goes back to what Paul was saying about these histories not being taught, and particularly, we know the histories of women, particularly women of color, have been put, you know, on the shelf and have often been overlooked. You know, looking at even the story of the Bennett Bells and their role in the sit-ins.
Yeah.
So, I was a master's student at the University of Montana, taking a class called Writing Women's Lives with my mentor, Dr. Anya Jabor, who's a phenomenal historian. And I came across the name Elrita Alexander. And I'm, you know, a native Western North Carolinian, and I had never heard of her.
Wow.
And so I just started doing the research. And the summer in between my program, the years of my master's program, I spent it here in Greensboro, and I did interviews. And I went through the
bet those were some
archives.
interesting interviews.
Interviews with, I mean, just phenomenal people like Justice Henry Fry, the late Yvonne Johnson. And so getting to know the history of the civil rights movement beyond the sit-ins, but also this phenomenal woman who was the first black woman from Columbia Law School
Wow.
that tends to get overlooked. And so, and the things, how crucial she was in the justice system, not just in Greensboro, but in the state of North Carolina, and how few people knew about her. And so, when I was applying to PhD programs, I applied to UNCG specifically so I could keep doing the research on Judge Alexander.
Well, I will tell you, a good friend of mine from Wake Forest, and she's retired Superior Court Judge Susan Bray, told me that one of the most fun things that she had done and was to read your book, because she said, I knew Judge Alexander, and it was just, and she goes, I just wanted to, every page I turned, I wanted to say something about, well, let me tell you this, you know. It was because of the personal stories that so many attorneys, and especially young women in this community during her day, just, and very much like Susie Sharp was a forerunner of women in the judiciary in North Carolina, and Judge Bray had grown up in Rockingham County, so she had known that family, you know, well. So.
But yeah, it just goes to, and even the personal stories are so interesting. I didn't want to write a book about this woman who just did this series of firsts.
Yeah.
But the stories and what she had to overcome, particularly doing this in the mid-20th century during the civil rights movement, and even the story with her and her husband is a testament to even some of the PTSD that these civil rights pioneers ended up living with because of the lengths that they went to overcome these barriers.
There's so much that we don't know, and we're losing people every day that we're actually connected to it. So what you're doing is so important in more than just the present, but in the future. And here at on the channel, we run biographical conversations that have been made over the years, and it's so refreshing to see them now because we're showing them to a whole new group of people. And that's what you guys are going to be doing basically is, I don't want to say re-educating because we've lost so much. I feel like with cell phones and computers, we lost a generation of people who the hands-on history wasn't that important.
Well, I think there are other ways to get them, and this is another thing that we're working on too. So my original research was on children and consumer culture. So all this stuff you're talking about with cell phones and Saturday morning cartoons and all this stuff. But I did an article about 3 or 4 years ago on the Schoolhouse Rock series, which I'm guessing most people will know what it is. It was an ABC Saturday morning cartoon in the 70s and 80s. And they ran a history series for the bicentennial, and their grammar shows are great, conjunction, junction, and the math stuff is great, but the history's not so good.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we're trying to do is find, we have a great team in place. We're still trying to find funding, hint, hint.
Right.
And we're trying to reach these kids where they are, because like a 3-minute hip hop video about Black history or something like that, we can put it on YouTube. We can put it on, I think it's a little long for TikTok, but in that general kind of idea, this is how we can reach these kids instead of just throwing up our hands and saying, cell phones. Well, we got to work with the new technology and reach these kids so that 10, 15 years from now, the students that we're getting in our classrooms, they know what the sit-ins were, and they know more than what the sit-ins were, right? They know about Wilmington. They know about the things that we didn't know growing up.
Well, as a kid, I remember Saturday mornings and the cartoon shows that I had, and then all of a sudden, I don't remember what the level of government said, you've got to put something educational on Saturday morning, and not just cereal commercials and the Flintstones. And so there started to be shows that interested me that were about not only history but science and things that they were done in a very good way. And it was during that same time period on Saturday morning. And I think about, just what you said, that how many kids we could reach with better pinpoint accuracy on history. Because history, was it, who said it, Santayana?
Yeah.
That, history's important. Give me a full quote.
Those who don't remember the past are doomed to repeat it.
Oh, golly, and aren't we seeing that?
So, yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I had a conversation just this past week with an executive out in Los Angeles that they're not making TV shows like Schoolhouse Rock or even Liberty's Kids or the science shows or, that kind of stuff isn't getting made right now. And so there's a whole coalition of people who are trying to turn that around. And so, we're hoping to be part of that group that in the next 4 or 5 years can really start putting some of this material out for students. Because some of the stuff that's out there is amazing and they're just not getting access to it.
Yeah. Well, and again, we're sitting here in modern day and we're talking about the fact that as a, 64-year-old adult, I didn't know about the Wilmington Massacre. And it wasn't taught in public schools. It wasn't taught in private school. It wasn't taught. And it doesn't even get talked about a lot still in New Hanover County. And if that's going on, it is very important to have these younger people find out about, historical facts and not fiction as soon as possible.
I'll tell you a cool story about one of my students who's now a librarian at Wake Forest, actually, but she was in my class about 10 years ago. She was from Asheboro, and she went to school, Asheboro High School, I think, and there were all these Confederate flags in the parking lot and whatever, and so she wanted to research the history of this Confederate memorials and these Confederate icons and everything. She found out that, is that Randolph County? Asheboro's Randolph County. Randolph County was the center of the desertion movement during the war. That the Confederates who wanted to run away found sanctuary basically in Randolph County because Randolph County was so against the rich people who were running the Confederacy, and they were losing. They were losing their young men.
They were the ones doing the fighting.
Yeah, faster than almost any county in this country.
And the same Quakers that settled Greensboro also settled the areas in Randolph County. The area that's now the North Carolina Zoo was called, I believe it was called Purgatory Mountain, because it was where so many of the deserters.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's so much irony in that.
Exactly, right? And so she came back to me with this, and I said, what? And yeah, I mean, this is the kind of stuff, you don't have to do a lot of digging to find this stuff pretty quickly.
Well, I remember as an 18-year-old kid, I worked for the Speaker of the House at that time in North Carolina, and all of a sudden, front page of the Raleigh News and Observer, there was the story about the sign down in Smithfield that said, "The Klan welcomes you to Smithfield." Well, it was on the front page of the paper because the sign was still there. It had faded out. Obviously, no one's going to be seen up there touching up the sign. Let's hope not, anyway. And but that was 1978, and so this was still an issue. It's like, and then with Silent Sam being taken down at Carolina, these are issues of today that we thought we settled them a long time ago.
I went to East Rowan High School outside of Salisbury, and the community of faith is still very much in the headlines because it refuses to take the Sons of Confederate Veterans out of its 4th of July parade, and because it was also a notorious sundown town.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And
but
these are still very. I graduated from high school in 2000, and it wasn't until I was in grad school that I read the book Klansville, USA, which was about the 1960s Klan being headquartered out of Granite Quarry, North Carolina.
Wow.
And it was quite a wake-up call as to the place that I thought I knew. I realized that I didn't know it all.
Yeah. Well, this is amazing, and I'm buoyed by the fact you guys are coming together to do some pretty big things.
Let me tell you one more story because I don't want to. No, I don't want to make it all sound like we're bashing on North Carolina or
Yeah.
bashing on the South. So let me tell you a northern story, okay? Because I'm the Yankee. I grew up in Massachusetts, and one of my friends from high school, he comes back. You know, his family goes back to the Mayflower or something like that in the 1600s, and he was doing his grad work and discovered that his direct ancestor, I don't know how many generations back, probably 7 or 8, was the largest slave trading merchant in the entire United States in the early 1800s.
Wow.
And you know what? He wasn't coming out of Charleston. He wasn't coming out of New Orleans.
Yeah.
He was coming out of Providence, Rhode Island.
Wow.
And so this is not
Yeah.
this
It's
is
a-
not a Southern story.
No, it's a story of the United States, and it is seems to be an ongoing story.
Yes.
It's not. I'm only laughing because the irony is palpable.
Yes.
And it's. But I want to thank both of you for being here. And
for having us.
oh
Thank you,
man,
John.
folks, I can't say enough about it. These are two of the smartest people we've got here in the county. And even though Jenny tries to hide out over in Winston-Salem, we still consider her part of Greensboro and Guilford County. So, and Paul, same way. I mean, he can hide out in High Point for a little while, but he lives here.
I do.
So, well, we do want to thank you, and good to talk to you, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Great.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks.